Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending upon where in the world you are as you watch this. Um, we had some interesting news over the last 2 weeks. Cardano blowing up, Vitalik pronouncing that you don't really need to use a layer one, layer twos do everything. And by the way, quantum computing is going to destroy elliptical curve cryptography. Interesting and some very entertaining parts in that because I have a distinct memory of meeting Mr. Hodgkins from Cardano and trying to have a civil conversation at a fairly standard level in which I said, well, the problem that you have with Cardano is that it's anonymous proof of stake, and anonymous proof of stake just doesn't work. Whereupon this little bearded man with his glasses absolutely exploded in rage to the point that the whole room started looking around at what this person was raging at. He was raging at me for the temerity of saying that anonymous proof of stake is a gameable system. So my
That's
propensity
that's
to
that
feel,
case, right? Of gaming the system doesn't make you the bad guy, but pointing out that it's gameable, ooh,
oh yeah,
you
yes,
can't do that.
No.
no, no,
So
no.
in defense of Cardano, they did spend years trying to build a decent looking staking pool.
They did.
So they didn't just jump
Hold on,
into it
before we
with,
get into that, look,
yeah,
I have no animus toward Cardano, much the same as I don't toward Hedera, Algorand, any of those guys, because I fully accept that they have done something useful. I just don't accept that what they've done is useful in the same context as blockchain. It's useful in the context of distributed ledger. And they are not the same thing. So maybe one of the two of you explain to the people watching why those two things are not the same thing, and then we'll get into Cardano from there.
So
yeah.
just
So where do we start?
well,
Yeah.
I
How
guess
about
just
how about we go with the
the
least
once
diplomatic
over.
version from Craig, and then we'll take the more diplomatic Swedish version from Ulf.
Okay, yeah. So just to cut to the chase, distributed ledger is a large category of things. DNS is a distributed ledger. LDAP is a distributed ledger. Just being a distributed ledger doesn't make it a blockchain. Blockchain's got a couple of extra features on there, which is even Postgres can be a distributed ledger because you can set up replication really easily now. That's not the important part of trying to manage money. Inside of any of those systems, whatever data you wanted to store in there, you could like predate stuff. You could, if you're the leader, you could just rewrite the history of it or get rid of the history of it or whatever. You have absolute control over how things get updated. Blockchain is a subset of distributed ledger, and it has a bunch of new rules on top of it. One of which is that a blockchain, you cannot update, you can't edit the prior history without that rippling all the way down to the current state of the chain. So there's no such thing as stealth updates on a blockchain. That's a really, really important rule. Another is that if there is a state machine that's built into the blockchain, like the Fate runtime or the Ethereum runtime or whatever, any of those allow you to programmatically update the state, but still you can't rewrite the previous history. And then the third part, I guess it's the big three things is rules to updating things. You can't update prior history, and leader selection is you don't I mean, you could have a permission blockchain. That's the thing you could have. But most blockchains, when we think about money systems, like the Gajumaru, for example, Groot, has to be proof of work because it's the only way that we know to safely do the minting function of blockchain. So
It's
there's a
not just it's not.
consensus.
Hold on, it's more fundamental than that. Yes, the minting function sits there, but long after the last Gaju has been minted, the key thing that Groot does is it gives you that contest between the trusted space, which is the infrastructure levels and above, and the trustless space. And the only way you can achieve a trustless space which is where you assume that all actors are hostile and bad actors, and you want to be able to trust only the message, not the messenger, securely at scale. The only way you can do that is proof of work. Everything
Yes.
else is a diminution from that state where you introduce some degree of trust. So whether it's verified known actor proof of stake, which we would argue is a valid form of proof of stake for a compromise between high frequency throughput, low cost transactions, and security, but you must understand that you are making a trade-off. And in every state, you're making a trade-off. In the proof of work context, the trade-off is speed. Even though the Gajumaru is, according to Grok, 529 million times faster than, or more efficient than Bitcoin, which I thought was a hilarious number. But the more I challenge
It's really
Grok on it,
specific.
the more it tells me that it's absolutely certain that this is the number. It is. I'm paraphrasing. It is a complete number with digits all the way along. It's not 529 million. It's very specific. But the point I'm getting at
Wow.
is, and this is core to our entire approach with this, is we believe, and we'll touch on this again in a minute, that Groot must be frozen in time effectively. That there comes a point where it is fully developed, and then there is no need to innovate there, because ultimately its role is not to be where everybody transacts. Its role is to be where you can go to if your competition is an authoritarian state, i.e. you're in an authoritarian, egregious infrastructure and you wish to have a change. So for example, if you were British and you wanted not to be taxed into non-existence and subjugated by an authoritarian government, you might decide that you'll stop trading in pounds and start trading in gajus. That's your choice. The trade-off being that when you're trading in gajus, it is not as low friction as it would be trading in pounds, because you're operating in a trusted space, and any SQL database is going to be infinitely faster than a distributed one. Anyway, the key thing is that we say is that once you've got the core proof of work space right, then you can put all of that interoperable infrastructure around it and allow that to carry the real burden of innovation and throughput, which is sort of what we're also touching on in the other part of this discussion, right?
Yeah.
This has been advocated elsewhere now.
Oddly
Right.
enough.
And also, I guess you could say that even for sort of trusted proof of stake or verifiable proof of stake, Cardano has made a huge contribution to the knowledge base when it comes to proof of stake and detecting and preventing various types of attack against proof of stake systems. So what you started out mentioning, that you still have the problem of anonymous proof of stake systems eventually devolving into some kind of cartel formation and behind the curtains with collusion, is very hard to solve algorithmically. It's a human problem, and it's essentially a poison pill for any power organization. Anytime you install vectors of influence where it would be profitable to corrupt the decision tree, then people are going to try to find ways to co-opt the halls of power, if you will. And if the trusted actors are anonymous, then this is going to become a problem. And we have seen, essentially, what you will see is that systems will tend to, supposedly independent actors are going to start acting as one, where they just magically agree on something that wasn't supposed to be obvious. And then you can imagine that there is collusion going on in the back rooms, but it's often very hard to
Well,
prove. It's
hold,
certainly
hold,
very hard to prove for a
hold on a
validator
second.
node.
So there's a couple of things to this. The first one is this. Everything you just alluded to can simply be pointed out in history, in human history. Name a point in time in human history, other than Jesus Christ and the 12 apostles, where a group of people had massive power and could act anonymously in order to concentrate that power and turn that into total control, and did not do so. There's just, it doesn't exist. So yes, you're right. What you're trying to do is algorithmically overcome realities of human nature, that if people are given the capacity to collude for massive power, especially when it comes to power and money, they will do so. They will play that game. And I've actually forgotten the point I was going to get to from what you had said. Forgive me. There was something interesting you said just there, and it sparked a thought, but this is my addled brain at this stage.
Yeah. So I guess this is actually the core challenge when you try to build truly decentralized systems. That
it must be algorithmically self-correcting. So whatever
Yes.
human game that the humans play, you're supposed to somehow develop an algorithm today that's going to preempt and break up whatever power game they play 10 years from now. That's not a thing that you can do. That's just a fundamentally broken idea. You have to, the only way to keep people balanced is to keep them in contention. And that's why proof of work is based on a competition. And that's the closest that we've got. We tried really hard to get around this. And there just isn't a way to not break that. And the Cardano's aware of that too. That's why they spent so much time trying to develop a balanced staking pool. But that staking pool will devolve over time is something that's not been given, I believe, enough attention on that side.
So of course we could perhaps point out that the thing that happened recently wasn't really didn't have anything to do with that. It was, we had a little discussion this morning about, in a decentralized system, how is it possible for any one guy to essentially bring down the network? It didn't actually bring down, he didn't bring down the network, he actually split the network. And so what we essentially,
at
I
face
guess what
value, that
happened
sounds
was
insane.
Yeah, they had identified a 3-year-old bug in the code that made it possible to post a transaction that would pass validation that shouldn't have. And it had been identified, it had been reproduced in testnet, and they had started fielding corrections to it. So about half the network or something had the updated code that would reject that that buggy transaction or invalid transaction. Now, this guy, this tester, had the brilliant idea to see what would happen if he pushed that bad transaction on the mainnet before the rollout of the updated code was complete. And it split the network in two, because the nodes that hadn't been updated yet accepted the transaction, but it was rejected by the other half of the network. And so I guess trading in ADA was blocked for 14 hours on Coinbase or something. So it has real world consequences. Now, Cardano rolled out a patch or an emergency fix for this. And that's an interesting dynamic in itself. Even in a fully distributed network, it would typically turn out to be the case that a trusted entity, which couldn't do it formally, can very quickly gather support for a network-wide update. If something is clearly broken and they have a quick fix, then people will just, give it to me. They will just suck in that patch immediately. And so, which is kind of nice in a way if you have a working community around a decentralized network and people are actually invested in keeping the network working. They can mobilize quickly if there is an emergency and then accept emergency patches very quickly. Now, there is of course a danger to that as well, because one of the things that stabilize a distributed network is that people don't just automatically suck in a patch from someone who says, trust me, bro, this is going to make things better. But if the system is clearly broken, they will be willing to do that. That I think has played out in several different blockchain networks. And there was another article about a report that had done an AI analysis of different blockchain networks and found that out of 166 blockchains inspected, about 16 of them had implemented support for blacklisting transactions or accounts, and 19 had, could easily do so, according to the report. Now, this is where I started thinking that, any well-designed blockchain system could easily implement an account blacklist. The question is, can you get the node operators in your system to accept the update? Because, every node is going to have a block of code that is a core feature of the system that does validation of everything it accepts. This is kind of a core feature of a blockchain node. It trusts no one, so it will validate everything. And if you put in a check there, and by the way, also check this account blacklist, and the blacklist is trivial to implement, then you will have a blacklist filter. That could be implemented and fielded on any blockchain within hours, kind of like Cardano implemented their emergency fix within 3 hours and resolved this problem once they had identified it, or whatever. You could implement an account blacklist about as quickly, and many of these blockchains actually, as it turned out, even BNB, Binance's blockchain, did so when there was some massive theft underway, exploiting some weakness, and they were observing someone stealing truckloads of crypto from their chain, and then that blacklist materialized out of thin air. So technically it's not hard to do. Culturally, blockchain people should be inoculated against inserting blacklists and backdoors, because it completely undermines the purpose of the whole system. But this is where it gets interesting, I guess. Culturally, is this actually true still?
No.
Were that true, everybody wouldn't be doing trading off chain in exchanges, just for example.
No, honestly, speaking as the poor bugger who has to talk to people all the time about funding us and why we're doing what we're doing and why it's important, I can tell you that the vast majority of people would really much prefer it if we just shut up and sat in the corner, because the way they're seeing it is decentralization is never going to happen. You just need to get with the program and shut up, because actually we're making lots of money now. And it's that classic I'm all right jag. I've been reading the book Starship Troopers to my son. And one of the tracts that I outlined, it's bedtime reading for a 10-year-old in my house, but anyway.
It's a great book.
But one of the things that I highlighted was they talk in the past tense about the 20th century that we have emerged from and how that broke down in the early part of the 21st century. Um, and some of the things that he touches upon are very, very interesting from a wider perspective. But essentially, he makes an argument beyond the one that the Rhodesians did, for example, in terms of qualified voting, which is that you have no right to vote unless you earn the right to vote, because you must have skin in the game. And what we're seeing, I think, at all the way across this industry, and sorry, the second part to the thing was not just that you must have skin in the game, but you must have a demonstrable record of having put the interests of the community and the world at large before your own. And that was where the step change from the Rhodesian qualified democracy of you're allowed to vote if you're a net taxpayer shifted across to saying not only must you have been a net taxpayer, but at some point you must have actually clearly demonstrated through your actions and deeds that you put society's well-being and your community before the interests of yourself. And some people argue that it's a fascist thing. It really isn't. If you read the book without being brainwashed first, there are some really interesting parts to it. But in essence, what we're seeing across the blockchain industry is an abdication of any responsibility to any generation that comes in the years to come. We keep talking about this being, I think we coined the phrase back when Trump was inaugurated and we were going over to the States, that it was the peer-to-peer electronic cash, no, the interplanetary peer-to-peer electronic cash system for the next 5,000 years. Because we often talk about how what we're doing is addressing a latent and massive growing issue in the world, which is that people under the age of 40 in the developed economies of the world have, as a generations, speaking collectively, not individually, because some will have money from their parents, but they're essentially barred from being part of the global economy. They're barred from owning their own home. The phrase is, you will own nothing and be happy, and of course in parentheses, or else. But the problem that we see, and why we've continued to push this rock up the mossy mountain, is that actually the direction of travel is, do you want to have 1917 and the Bolshevik Revolution, or do you want to have 1789 and the French Revolution? Because that's the track we're going to go on if we continue to suppress and oppress people and take away from them their hope. When somebody has nothing left, when you have subjugated them into the ground, you either have a slave or a rebel. And that Hobson's choice that the world is being pushed toward is what we're trying to avoid. And that's what everybody who believed in decentralization used to understand. They understood when the Bitcoin white paper came out, what has happened in the global financial crisis simply cannot happen again. This is terrible. And it caught fire because people understood what had happened. Somehow or other, in the intervening period, two things have happened. One, the population at large has forgotten 2008 global financial crisis, which is amazing because we're about to do it all over again. And the second thing is the so-called decentralization industry has actually said, do you know what? Centralization is okay so long as we already have a huge amount of value staked in the system in our pockets. So this, and coming back to the conversation we have here, this is what Vitalik had to say. Right, so he said, Buterin, this is coming from DL News. ossification isn't binary. Buterin argued that Ethereum can ossify different layers at different speeds. The consensus layer would lock down changes while the Ethereum virtual machine remains openly flexible, or vice versa, which is mostly just nonsense. The goal isn't to stifle or kill innovation, but to redirect it away from the base layer into the surrounding ecosystem, which is what we've been saying since day one. Nice that Vitalik has caught up. That means layer 2 rollups, wallets, privacy tools, and user-facing applications, not fundamental protocol changes. So he's essentially saying something like what we are, which is that we should freeze the core base in Aspic. The big difference is that the core he wants to freeze is the one that he and his friends control, because they have all the stake. And it's a anonymous proof of stake system. So pinky promise, it's not being controlled by the founders of Ethereum, by Binance, BlackRock, Vanguard, just keep going. Pick a bunch of them and try and tell me that they don't actively conclude on what's going to happen. And the other part to this is he then goes on to say, layer 2s already handle most of Ethereum's transaction volume. The more activity that moves there, the more space opens up on layer 1 for settlement and security. Now, this is absolute swill. And I'm going to steal from Peter Harpending, who did a great job on looking at, and I'm not allowed to say the name because my board feel that we should not call out people who are acting in a way that is deeply fraudulent, even when they are. So we looked at a ZK rollup architecture to layer 1. And it's intended to be the framework for a national blockchain. If you work out who I'm talking about, well done. If you don't, well, I hope one day the people who have paid for this actually figure out what's happened and put all the people who missold this to them in jail. So they're talking about, in their white paper, a ZK rollup architecture, and they use the phrase extremely low cost. And we say, but extremely low cost to whom? It doesn't mean you, because in their words, the primary means of exchange for transaction fees and validator payments is the X token rather than ETH. This is akin to a carnival bragging about their extremely low cost. They, in all likelihood, mean their operating costs, not your costs as a user. A ride on the Ferris wheel is priced in carnival tickets, over which the carnival has an absolute monopoly. The carnival also maintains the absolute authority to kick you out of the carnival anytime with no refund, and your carnival tickets won't work at a competing carnival. This sounds like all the layer 2s to you? Because that's exactly what it is, right? But it gets worse. Because, again, this whole thing of the roll-up, it just is mathematically impossible. So Peter, who is a mathematics genius, goes on to say, here are the mathematics at play. We generously assume that the only data that survives the roll-up process from one transaction is a 20-byte truncated sender public key, a 20-byte receiver public key, a 65-byte signature. This leaves us with 105 bytes per transaction that must survive the roll-up process. 105 bytes per transaction times 10,000 transactions per second, because this so-called national blockchain claims to be able to handle 10,000 transactions per second with a 12-second block. So 105 times 10,000 times 12. That's 12,600,000 bytes per block. Now this has to survive the roll-up process, because this is the key 3 sets of data that must be communicated. Assuming that this definitionally incompressible data is in fact incompressible, we are already in the realm of literal impossibility, because Ethereum blocks have a theoretical maximum size of 6,800,000 bytes and a practical maximum of roughly 100,000 bytes. Now, I fully appreciate that this industry loves to
and this was one L2.
Yes, this is one, right? This is one, right? So I fully appreciate this industry gets off on hoodwinking people with ChatGPT written documentation that is incredibly artful in its use of the English language. But unfortunately, mathematics and physics are absolutes and they are truths. There is no such thing as a greater truth than a mathematical proof. You can have guilty beyond reasonable doubt. Right, there's still doubt. Beyond reasonable doubt, but there's still doubt. Mathematical proof, no, you cannot do this. So let us further assume that an absurd 95% compression rate is realistic and applies to this data, which it does not.
Which it
but
doesn't.
Let's play along. In this case, that 12.6 megabytes of data compresses down to 630 kilobyte block. There are two possible paths to get the L2 data onto the Ethereum L1. The expensive option is store it as a normal transaction. The cheap option is use Ethereum's EIP 4844 blob system, which was specifically added for L2s, because don't forget, Ethereum is very, very happy not evolving because they're getting all the rolled up transactional fees, and that keeps the bubble of Ethereum moving along and the illusion that it works to continue to perpetuate. So pathway one, expensive option, transaction storage. The recent historical average Ethereum block size is roughly 100 kilobyte block. This is not something that we're making up. This was drawn directly from etherscan.io/chart/block size. The largest average block size over the span of a single day occurred on the 6th of January 2024, with the average block size being 272,027 bytes per block. So already, assuming they can compress the most minimal possible incompressible, it cannot be compressed. This is like igneous rock. So assuming they can compress the most minimal possible incompressible data by 95%. So we are truly existing in the realm of utter magic. Dorothy can click her heels together and transport herself across time and space. They have to shoehorn 6 times the average block size worth of data into a single block, every block, for one L2. There are as many L2s out there as you can point at, hundreds of them. A few of them are quite big, and they are all regulatory arbitrage. Anyway, let's be nice and go to pathway 2, the cheap option, which is blob storage. The bottleneck is Ethereum's EIP-4844 blob system. There is a network-wide budget of 128 kilobytes per blob. There is a maximum of 9 blobs produced every 12 seconds, i.e. per Ethereum block. This gives us a budget of 1,179,648 bytes per block to work with for all roll-ups combined across all users of the Ethereum blob system, which again includes every other L2. The 630 kilobyte block
all of them dragging tremendous performance.
Oh, look, it's a bit like that thing I wrote about Bitcoin, and I talked about the guy that I met in the queue in 2014 or 2015 to go into this first meetup in Dublin about decentralization. And he was telling the guy in front of him, one day Bitcoin's going to go to $50,000. And I tapped him on the shoulder and said, that's rubbish. One day it's going to go to $500,000. And essentially my argument was, well, if you're going to make up stupid numbers, just make up a much bigger one. I mean, if you're going to dream big, pal. Why sit here in the sort of the foothills? Let's go big or go home. And he actually thought that was great reasoning, and then turned to the guy in front and said, no, he's right. It's going to go to 500,000. Why? Because he wanted to believe this. Okay, this is the problem. People want to believe that this stuff is real. So they see the mumbo jumbo technical babble that makes no sense to man nor beast. They don't feel like swallowing their pride and saying, hey, this makes no sense to me in front of a room of other people who seem to be nodding along, going, yes, that makes great sense, who are all thinking exactly the same thing. This is insane. I have no idea what this guy is talking about, but if I don't say yes, I'll look really bad.
Greg's over here selling mirages to people, not realizing how thirsty they are.
And look, so unfortunately, people want this stuff to be true, so they listen to it. But I'm going to finish what Peter wrote because it's excellent. So the 630 kilobyte block figure represents 53% of the available blob space, which must be used in every block. Even their more conservative claim in the end section of 2,000 transactions per second still consumes roughly 10% of the available blob space in every block. This is a small country, in a small but very wealthy country, not in Europe. And their population is relatively small. Not tiny, you know, we're still talking about at country size. It's not like, you know, Andorra or Liechtenstein or
San Marino.
San Marino, thank you. I was trying to think of the football team that's full of postmen. It's not that size. This is a sizable economy. This is a sizable country, just small. It's not Italy or America or something like that. And if their best possible outcome is to eat 10% of global Ethereum layer 1 capacity in the completely magical state that we could possibly arrive at, pretending that incompressible data can be compressed by 95%, etc., 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 what happens when America decides that it will embrace a layer 2 solution to use Ethereum? This is, of course, assuming that they're not going to go down the road with someone like Canton and a fictional global synchronizer, which they run, they and their foundation, or Dfinity, which they and their foundation.
That project you're discussing, though, it also has a global synchronizer inside of it. I remember that paper.
Of course it does.
It was
How
nuts.
else are you meant to con everybody out of their money without having a global synchronizer?
That thing also stank of ChatGPT pretty bad, the descriptive paper.
I'm not sure that it stank of ChatGPT. I think it more stank of, how to put it, your phrase, it stank of ChatGPT, would mean that somebody actually edited what ChatGPT produced. I don't think they did. I think they literally just fed
this was just the turd.
Yeah. So I think ChatGPT wrote this entire thing. But anyway, so Peter goes on to say both of these alternatives are practically, as in the real world, impossible. Now, again, I want to emphasize the point here. Peter is not only an autist, Peter is a mathematician. Impossible is a word that means exactly what it says on the tin to him. If we also factor in the fact that they explicitly state later in the so-called white paper that the idea is to have multiple X chains operating in parallel, a unified X bridge could handle bridging for a family of X chains, which is where you were going there, Greg. Then we move beyond the realm of practical impossibility into literal impossibility. The basic problem here is that piling on more L2s doesn't multiply throughput, it divides a fixed pie. The fixed pie being the size of the blocks we mentioned earlier. We can make a direct analogy with international shipping. International shipping is heavily constrained by the bandwidth of the Panama and Suez canals. This problem is not solved by adding more ships. There is no way to solve the canal bandwidth problem that involves going through the canals. Further, these canals are an obvious Achilles heel for any hostile actor that wishes to disrupt global shipping, which we've seen with the Houthi situation in Yemen. And you've now got people rooting around around South Africa. Ultimately, it comes to this. They talk about scalability, and Peter writes excellently within this. The claim that you can have scalability without compromising security is simply not true. We've said this earlier in this conversation. They completely abandon any pretense of security with their centralized sequencing system, which is what you touched on a moment ago, Craig, which we'll address in detail further down. Ethereum provides security and decentralization. This is quoting from them. Ethereum provides security and decentralization, while the ZK rollup layer offers scalability. ZK rollup does not provide scalability, as we have elucidated in the prior section. In addition, to achieve this illusion of scalability, they centralize all authority regarding transaction inclusion, exclusion, and ordering in a centralized sequencer. But it's okay, don't worry, because users trust the sequencer, in their words. Allow us to restate a categorical truth. The entire purpose of blockchain is to allow us to trust the message, not the messenger, here the sequencer, in the Canton system, the global sequencer, as they call it, securely at scale. If you cannot trust the message, then any use of blockchain is grossly inefficient relative to a centralized database and exists only to create a dangerous illusion of trust. Regulatory arbitrage. In this attempt to create the illusion of scalability, X have completely abandoned any pretense of security or decentralization. It is technically true that, to use their words, the X approach addresses the blockchain trilemma, balancing security, decentralization, and scalability, because technically none of the above counts as balance.
So
and
I guess one should.
Orwell, no one believes more firmly than Comrade Napoleon that all animals are equal. He would be only too happy to let you make your decisions for yourselves. But sometimes you might make the wrong decisions, comrades, and then where should we be? Said the European Commission. Said, it's funny, you look at things like the George Orwell wrote in Animal Farm, and it's hysterical. I mean, you had the Brexit vote in Britain, and it was clearly you've all voted the wrong way. We need to do that again. When Ireland voted, and this is, I was actually kicked out of the British Conservative Party for being pro a federal Europe. And I argued for this at the Christmas dinner as the maiden speaker, and didn't go down well. Well, I also accused them of being bereft of any principles or policy that were principle derived. But that was the kicker rather than the open. Anyway, the European Commission said exactly the same thing to the people of Ireland when they got the wrong answer to the Lisbon Treaty vote. And in 2009, they were told to vote again with menaces because this time the Troika would end the Irish economy if they didn't agree.
That was a pretty big red flag. But trying to bring that up is like, it didn't have much effect at the time. I do remember it, but we had that discussion in Sweden as well. It's like, oh, apparently there is only one right answer to these referendums. It's like, you're going to have to do it over until you vote yes.
What was the name of that drunk that used to be the head of the European Commission?
Dale drunk?
No, he was a shambolic drunk, head of the European Commission before Darth Vader's daughter. Actually, it's not Darth Vader, it's Emperor Palpatine's daughter. What's her name? Ursula von der Leyen.
Right.
The guy before him, he was actually really funny because I think he was drunk all the time and he just told the truth. And despite the fact he was telling the truth, no one seemed to pay any attention. So when he was asked about the vote in the Catalan people wanting to vote for independence, absolutely, the Spanish police were right to beat them all down. Democracy is really just people getting the wrong vote, all sorts of hilarious things. I must remember his name, but he was so funny about it because he just said exactly what the European Commission's perspective was on these things, and nobody ever picked him up on it. None of the so-called mainstream media. Anyway, we've gone miles off topic, and as I'd like to get this on YouTube, I'm very careful that where this particular group of people might end up and where we therefore will end up on YouTube, which is banned. So,
To jail with you.
Coming back to this whole thing, you know, we've talked about freezing the core of the chain, and not freezing, but saying that from our perspective, the whole RIPA idea, resource infrastructure platform application, the reason we call it the Gajumaru, because you have a common root, a forest of trunks, an interwoven forest, canopy of branches, and then the leaves, which is the application layer. And we've always said that there really is no need for great innovation at the proof of work layer, and we don't see that with any real computing, as opposed to fiction, that you can get to a much greater efficiency than we've built into Groot, the core of the Gajumaru. So we think that all of the real innovation could and should happen at the national blockchain level, the industry blockchain level, you know, the infrastructure level, which is an interoperable universe of commerce, economics, data, activity, etc., mostly occurring within a trusted space. And because it's within that trusted space, you have much, much more efficiency. So now you could, for example, have an associate chain that is literally just an SQL database run by a single entity, the US Treasury, for example.
Where settlements are local and not dependent on having to do roll-ups to the central chain.
But here's the big difference. Because not only do we have, so the Ethereum system approach is to have an anonymous proof of stake, completely gained so-called resource layer, but it's actually infrastructure because it has governance, it's just hidden from you. And then to have these layer twos provide the throughput functionality, which, as we've pointed out, caps at probably 2,000 transactions per second globally. So, and even then, that's being extraordinarily generous. So when we look at this, we're talking about having a genuine, highly efficient proof of work resource layer, open, governance-free resource layer that connects in this infrastructure. And that infrastructure can have within it much, much higher throughput speeds because it can just be, as you point out, a localized operation. It can just run off an SQL database. It could be anonymous proof of stake. It could be verified proof of stake. It can be any of these things. It can be whatever their designers want it to be. And the people who use it either trust that operator or they do not. Now, as it stands, if you're living in the United Kingdom today, there is no godly way that you can trust the UK government to do anything other than tax you into oblivion and ensure that you're robbed of any possessions that you have without the police doing anything because they're very busy doing things that 20 years ago we didn't even know were crimes. What you're going to see then is they don't have a choice today. We're trying to give people a choice. And by giving that choice, by creating a tension between the free space and the free trustless space and the controlled trusted space, hopefully each tempers the other. But that is not going to be the case with what Vitalik is promoting in this context. He's saying that you should take infrastructure, which is Ethereum, and then mount unregulated, unsupervised, unaudited, so-called layer twos that are using magic to create the pretense of scale. Have I got any of that wrong? Is there anything you guys would add to that?
There's kind of a magic trick there where when you say layer two, they say, well, this is a blockchain. This is a global thing, which means it exists outside of jurisdictions. And then you don't know the operators because they come up with some consensus scheme for the layer two itself. The correct answer for an infrastructure layer is to bind it to a jurisdiction optimally so that there is recourse to something crazy happens in there, and you do know who the operators are, and that's like what the banking system is supposed to be, right? Um, that's
Well,
what
the
infrastructure should
whole
look
idea
like, is
is
like
that,
banking.
look, so I'm going to be writing a big article about shadow banking and banking, because a lot of the things that have gone on are really, that the emergence of shadow banking and the leverage that it operates with are things that people should be very, very concerned about. But fundamentally, we put banks into a position of massive trust, and we put them into those positions of massive trust because they have supposedly actively managed regulatory oversight, which is supposed to say, well, look, you can only lend so much money relative to the deposits you have. You must maintain transparency on this data, this data. There have to be clear reporting lines on this information, that information. There are literally hundreds of things that they have to comply with, that they can and are regularly tested on. Now, whether those things amount to the same thing that will actually stop them doing something stupid a la 2008, which wasn't just about greed on the part of bankers, it was also about political pressure to increase home loan lending, even to people who clearly couldn't pay back the price of a toothbrush. Um,
Mm-hmm.
what when we talk about these things and we talk about having associate chain infrastructure, we are assuming that in almost all cases there will be some sort of infrastructural governance agreed between the users, whether that is dictated through the artifice of democratic election, where a government establishes an associate chain, and that associate chain essentially becomes like the digital economy border, in the same way that in the physical economy there are borders and there are rules that apply to things, goods, services, etc. People, goods, services, etc. coming in and out of the country all have rules attaching to them, and they're different for each of the countries that those people, goods, services come from, and so on. But all of these things, in theory, have some sort of oversight, because in theory, your national government, unless of course you live in a dictatorship where all of the parties collude to be exactly the same thing with slightly more or slightly less inbreeding, a la the United Kingdom and the Conservative and Labour Party, or indeed Ireland, where you have no choice but left or far left. But in theory, what you have is an oversight level where you have anonymous proof of stake. Let us underline this again and again, and I don't care how loudly the people like Charles Hodgkinson scream. The truth is, you can game that system. It is gameable, and if you read anything of human history and human nature, it is gamed. And this goes back to what you said earlier, Craig and Ulf. We're trying to algorithmically cover up for something that is human nature, and we cannot. What we must instead assume is that all actors are bad actors and operate in a proof of work context in order to achieve genuine decentralization and a genuine capacity to trust the message, not the messenger. Before we go on to the talks about elliptical curves being outdated by quantum, which I think is another discussion altogether in a sense, do you guys have anything to add to the wonderfully self-serving commentary from Mr. Vitalik Buterin?
I do have two things to touch on. One is that yes, you want those regionalized or jurisdictionally bound infrastructure associate chains to be bound by a jurisdiction, ideally. But the ultimate backstop against all this is that they still can't mint Gajus. If they get up to funny business down there, they only screw their own segment. There is no way to globally hyperinflate the Gaju, which is that's the whole backstop that proof of work provides for us. So that leads into this kind of fractional reserve banking. Could you recreate that somewhere? Yes, it's super dangerous. The fact that you can't, nobody in the world can inflate the Gaju or put their finger on the scale of the minting function. That backstop is so deadly that fractional reserve banking is probably pretty dangerous in Gajus. And you mentioned leverage just now about shadow banking and how they're leveraged. And I have speculative question. You say that they have to have. I'd asked you before about shadow banking, and you said, well, it's like banking, but they're loaning money that they have. But I didn't ask if they were leveraged. Now, hypothetical leverage.
It was quite a funny conversation because you asked the question, can they do fractional lending like banks? And I said no.
Right,
and then you moved on to talk about something else. So
Right.
I didn't interrupt. I waited for a while and then said, you asked the wrong question.
Right. Are they leverage? So hypothetical leverage question. I go to a bank. I want to be a shadow bank. I go to a bank that can do fractional reserve banking. I get them to write me a gigantic loan. So we've just spun a bunch into existence. Now I go out separately and I do the shadow banking function and loan that out. That's a thing that surely happens, right?
Okay, so let's explain what shadow banking is. Start there. Shadow banking describes financial intermediaries that perform bank-like functions, taking in funds, making loans, transforming maturities, but outside of banking regulations.
Is that illegal or
It's
legal
not illegal
or
at
gray?
all.
Okay.
Now, as you point out, they don't have many of the benefits of being a bank. So they can't do fractional lending. They can't do a lot of the things that a bank has permission to do, is set up to do. But at this moment in time, about $250 trillion, which is just under 50% of global financial assets, are actually within the broadest measure of shadow banking. If you want to reduce it purely to lending, it's about 70 trillion. I think $78 trillion. I can't remember exactly. It's absolutely huge. So what these guys do is they have credit intermediation without deposit insurance. So let's take a money market fund. Investors place cash with the fund, expecting stable value and liquidity, functionally equivalent to a bank deposit, but much, much bigger scale. The fund invests in commercial paper repos and short-term securities, functionally equivalent to bank lending. And the fund earns a spread, right? But the money market fund has no deposit insurance. So when you, people in the United Kingdom, I don't know about other countries, but I remember this happening in the United Kingdom, and there was a scramble to open new bank accounts. So when the global financial crisis hit in 2008, the UK government said that they would backstop up to 50,000 of deposits in every account. And so people who had, let's say, £200,000 on deposit in the bank immediately went and opened 3 more bank accounts and moved 50,000 to each one. So a money market fund has no such deposit insurance. This is really important to understand. It has no central bank access, and there are no capital requirements. So when the Reserve Primary Fund broke the buck in September 2008, returning 97 cents per dollar after Lehman Brothers commercial paper became worthless, it basically triggered a run on the whole sector, the whole money market fund sector. So you would think that we would have learned our lessons. In fact, we really haven't. And a lot of the measures that I would argue that a lot of, I don't need to argue because the market argues for me, but it's the academics don't like this. All of the things that we've done to restrain this kind of activity have actually led to more bleeding from the regulated space into the unregulated space. So what then starts to happen is you've got hedge funds, these massive funds, they can borrow like $9 for every $1 of investor capital, a 10-to-1 leverage. So a 10% gain on assets produces 100% return on equity. Now, I can get really boring and explain to you how funds can use medium-term notes like this, where there's no coupon, but the value is entirely in the fund, in the zero knowledge. Sorry, not zero knowledge. In the zero coupon bond. So a zero coupon bond essentially says, look, we're not going to pay you anything, but you're going to buy the bond today for $500, and in 10 years' time, we'll give you back $1,000. So everything is about the time value of money. Okay, all of these types of calculations are about the time value of money. So you're asking, what's your net present value? What's your future value? So you can have a lot of fun with the time value of money calculation. There's a Texas Instruments, and I think it's only Texas Instruments who make it, that it's this little, every investment banker on earth has got one. And it has this time value of money calculator built into it. And, I forget who it was that said that the most powerful force in economics is compounding interest. But when you start to look at these things, you can see it. So let's say a bond has a 6% yield, and instead of paying 6% on 1,000 every year, it pays it works backward. So what will happen is on the maturity date, they are due to pay you back $1,000 per zero coupon bond. But on the day of issuance, it's, let's say, $500. So you as a fund, what you do is you go and you buy, you get $1,000, let's say, and you buy the zero coupon bond at issuance, knowing that worst case, you're going to be made whole. You then take the other 50% of the money you have and leverage it up to the wazoo and start getting leveraged returns on top. This is not unknown. This is how the system works. But as you hear me saying this, because you're a sensible person who's thinking this through as I'm talking, the alert levels start going off in your head, because leveraging what? Leveraging how? This is all the bubble of everything type problem that's going on. So, and
I'm just wondering who's
worse.
doing all the work at the bottom of this somewhere that's supposedly making things that are real. They don't have to. They don't have to be real.
I recall a video by the YouTuber Eurodollar University the other week or so. He was talking about a fund backed by BlackRock, which basically went from 100% valuation to 0 in 3 weeks.
That's a big difference. Damn.
And well, he had a couple of other examples as well, essentially indicating that it doesn't seem to be an isolated phenomenon. And I guess it's sort of is an indication of all these lines of reasoning. When you're talking about the time value of money, it has to be based on some fundamental, well, I guess what we would call invariants in programming. Like, there are some things that you expect to be stable, and then you do the calculus based on that. And interestingly, for example, if you talk to traditionally, I guess it's been kind of like the dollar, US dollar, or maybe gold. In the Bitcoin world, they like to talk about how Bitcoin doesn't have a ceiling because fiat doesn't have a floor. And as long as you evaluate Bitcoin in US dollars, then it can go as high as the moon, presumably, because there is no limit to how weak the dollar can get. Now, I guess the problem is people will selectively choose
some dark implications there.
Their invariant. Yeah, because it's kind of hard to think through how everything is connected, and how basically when the faith breaks in one part of the system, this has ripple effects across the entire system, and then you realize that everything is connected, and you also realize that you don't know how. And then faith breaks everywhere, because no one understands how it all fits together, and everyone runs for the bank. And
well, if the price of Bitcoin increases by 5% over term X, and in that same term, the dollar inflated by 10%, did Bitcoin go up in value? This is like one of those GDP measure problem questions.
Yeah, which brings us to the outstanding article about the value of Bitcoin that Mr. Chu wrote the other
Aha!
day. I
He
thought
did.
it
It's
was an
great.
excellent read. Very balanced, very informative.
You
Kind
need to
of
put a link
just
to that in
laid
the
out the
description of this
logic
video.
in good faith. And I recalled that I had made an argument, I don't think we published it, where I was sort of tried to develop the line of reasoning that, well, Bitcoin could be the stable coin of crypto because it has enough momentum. It's been the big gorilla of the crypto world, and also fluctuations in Bitcoin, if you look at it in terms of percentage, it's not that much anyway. If it goes from 100 to 110,000, well, it's a 10% move. Then I started looking at the presumably unstable fiat currencies. Like, we think that, for example, the dollar is unstable. Well, not if you compare to Bitcoin. Then the fiat currencies are extremely stable. And we still think that there is a big currency risk, and that while we are waiting for an invoice to be paid in a foreign currency, we anxiously look at how our own currency is moving in relationship to that. And then in any sane jurisdiction, you also have to declare to the tax authorities how much you potentially gained or lost on the exchange rate while waiting for payment to come in. And for big corporations, this can become, these numbers add up tremendously.
Well,
And
this, I think, is our hypothesis for the Gaju, in essence, is that there is no global resource currency. We believe the Gaju can be that because it's designed to be what Bitcoin was supposed to be, but actually delivering. And the videos we've been putting up recently, that they're showing huge numbers of huge throughput, and as we've often said, the world's fastest payment system. Why? Because we're measuring settlement, not just the transaction being entered into the mempool. So sub 6 second settlement, that's faster than me if you were working in a shop and I handed you €100 note or a €50 note, you would have to scan the note for fraud, for counterfeiting, before you could open the till. So you'd have to put all the details into the till and everything else. By the time you've done all those things, actually, the Gaju would already have transacted and settled. So we're faster even than cash. But it's not meant to be the currency that is used in an everyday context necessarily, because, again, we come back to the idea that within a well-functioning infrastructure, such as a national blockchain, a properly managed and stewarded currency actually will have a stable value in of itself against the Gaju, because you're not inflating monetary supply. So again, coming back to that point, that the idea is that the trustless and the trusted space act to combat one another's extremist tendencies. So, Craig talked very well about the high seas and the fact that navies patrol the high seas. So the high seas are a global resource for trade and commerce, and navies do patrol them because it serves everyone's interest to do so. But that doesn't mean that they control them. Patrol and control are two very different things. So I think there's something very interesting in that dynamic, that potentially the adoption, the broad scale adoption of the Gaju would actually drive a lessening of the instinct that governments have to print money and thereby pass today's problems to tomorrow's children, which is what they've been doing. I mean, the budget coming out in the UK today is going to be one of the most destructive in British history, if not the most destructive in British history. These things are a function of a government who have no real control and who are doing as they please in order to maintain the pretense of their agenda. But the outcome is going to be that the people of the United Kingdom are going to be enormously poorer in real terms. Without having a control function, without having an alternative, there is no control function. There is no real capacity to reel in that kind of behavior. Any other points to talk about in regard to the wonders of Vitalik's self-serving commentary before we move to, and indeed the Cardano issue, before we move on to elliptic curve?
Well, that's the other thing that he said. We're still kind of in Vitalik land today.
Yeah, there was a time when things he had to say were actually interesting and not entirely self-serving. Not anymore. Anyway, elliptic curve cryptography apparently is dead because computation. The elliptic curve cryptography is dead because quantum computing is going to end it within 5 years.
Right, but without that detail, it's more like people got spooked because Vitalik said something, not that that's what the origin of his kind of well, I don't know what the motivation behind what he said actually was, because he's a smart guy. He could have read the blog post himself. I don't think he did.
So I
don't know.
Possibly a generous interpretation would be that it was the article we read was essentially referring to a Q&A session, and it was kind of interesting. I thought that a lot of it seemed to be about the liquidity run and the fact that we may be heading into an extreme liquidity crisis.
We might find out how much fake crypto there is now.
And in that context, it almost seemed like the punchline would be, well, never mind that, because elliptic curve cryptography will be broken before the next presidential election, which I would be more concerned about the liquidity crisis, not least because I followed one of the links to Forbes that said, and this was a week ago, they said that Bitcoin seems to have found a floor at $86,000. And I looked into CoinMarketCap and said, well, apparently that wasn't a floor because it's below that now, a week later. So, and so anyway, we did cover that, the whole value of anything and liquidity runs. But so then, of course, quantum computing is always good for clickbait, and the God box thing that is going to break all crypto and reveal all secrets. Hollywood delivered that decades ago, but when we looked at that blog post, it was actually, I think, a very technical blog post from a very knowledgeable researcher in quantum computing. And his prediction was quite a technical one, that he thought, and you have to sort of enable your sort of PhD lingo parsing mode, where every word matters. And he, when he was saying, I think there is a live possibility, in his world, this would mean that I think that there is actually a significant possibility that this could even be done. That a fault-tolerant quantum computer will be able to execute Shor's algorithm. Now, the most hand-wavy part of that was before the next presidential election, if there even is one, essentially. So this is where he started getting a little bit non-technical, but
I think being a little silly, like on purpose.
Yeah. So one thing, of course, was it actually occurred to me when I was reading that this hadn't been done yet, executing Shor's algorithm on a fault-tolerant quantum computer. Now, Shor's algorithm is the key to breaking crypto because it is a way to factor prime numbers. Now, being able to execute it at all, essentially that means you can factor small prime numbers, but you can do it in the right way on some quantum computer that is actually able to separate the signal from noise.
Mm-hmm.
At,
So
at
most
any
people
reasonable,
don't know
yes,
that's not a thing yet. Most people have it in their head that we have Shor's
yes,
algorithm. This has been a thing we've been doing for a long time. Quantum computing is essentially a solved problem. Scale is the question now. No, like nobody is actually, we're simulating doing this. Theoretically, when we can maybe if we can solve the hardware problems, be able to do this, but we don't have a fault tolerant or an error corrected rather actual working implementation of a quantum computer doing all this stuff right now, even at tiny scales. That's not quite a thing yet. And people have it in their head that like, this is already a solved problem. I don't know how the narrative changed, but like quantum computing still is really hard, and it kind of, it's hard to get right. And every time most of what we do with algorithmic or development of algorithms is simulate running them on a quantum system, because we know what the properties of an ideal quantum system should be. So you simulate them on a classical computer, which takes a lot more computing time, of course, but that's how you can do this to develop algorithms and try to understand, get your head around the problem and even learn about it. But it's not like there's some factory somewhere producing quantum computers that already do this right now and that are just about to break some scale barrier where, oh my goodness, all of your crypto keys are about to be broken next month or something. That's not a thing. He's saying very narrowly so this blog post very narrowly says maybe before the next presidential election, we might actually be able to execute Shor's algorithm at all, at any scale at all, which means tiny, be able to even do this in practice instead of in simulation. That's a pretty big difference between what people perceive the state of the art to be and where things actually are right now. And so going from this guy making that prediction to just being on stage and saying, "Oh, ECC's dead. There won't be any crypto in 4 years." Like, what? That's a completely wild extrapolation.
Now, I guess it's kind of hard to boil it down to sort of common man intuition, but I guess one thing that most people know about quantum is that it can only be observed at the subatomic layer. Now, what that actually means, the important takeaway in this context, is that scale does matter a lot when you talk about quantum phenomena. A lot of people like to think that quantum physics actually is applicable. This is a new age thing. People think they get quantum physics, and then they start applying quantum physics to the real world, and they think that the observation problem is actually a thing in the real world, in like the macro scale world. And I guess as a thought experiment, it can sometimes be useful to remind ourselves that we are not as rational as we think we are. But in terms of physical manifestations, we can't just entangle ourselves into some flux state and walk through a wall. It is not a thing. The good thing about that is that we don't suddenly spontaneously melt through the floor either. So I think most of the time, that kind of possibility, especially if we don't understand how and when it happens, would mean that we wouldn't survive long.
How
And
many wildly disordered states are there versus the one set of states that result in the cool effect, right? People don't
so
think through that very carefully.
so the interesting thing about quantum computing is that we're trying to move from being able to absorb quantum effect or observe quantum effects at subatomic levels to trying to scale it up to having any kind of device that can actually run this in a controlled way and use it for computing. And even a tiny qubit fault tolerant is massive scale for quantum computing.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that it's very hard to separate the meaningful signal from noise, because as soon as particles start interacting with the environment, then this starts breaking down. And so then you basically have to be close to vacuum and trying to have gravitational shielding and near absolute zero temperatures
Right.
to
You gotta
even
stop
be
all the
able to
ticks.
do anything.
Just
And then,
an
yeah,
observation here. We talked earlier about mathematics and physics. You know, Craig often talks about how decentralized, the claims of decentralized systems fly in the face of the laws of physics and essentially the speed of light. Everything you're describing here, pervasive quantum computing it's going to make the so-called AI expenditure on hardware look small if it were to become pervasive. Because what I've read, and I'm nowhere near the expert you guys are on this, what I've read on quantum computing tells me that these are multi-billion-dollar projects just to get them to a proof of concept. As you pointed out, the physical requirements in order to be able to execute in the execution environment are phenomenal. So my question is, why is it so hard for people in the tech industry to tell the truth? Why do we constantly have these ridiculous loops of hype and rubbish? Why are we constantly expected to swallow absolute rubbish? And at what point does the average person in the street start to think to themselves, hold on a sec, every time one of you guys gets on a podium and talks, you talk complete rubbish. It's babble, which I don't understand, but what I do understand at the end is it's absolute rubbish. Large language models, I had this discussion with someone the other day who was telling me about private equity access from the bond, they run a company that does, they will buy a chunk of equity from, let's say, SpaceX, and then fractionalize it to give it to some of their clients who will also be very high net worth individuals. So people writing sort of $50,000 check size who would be excluded from a deal that would require a $500 million check size. And I said, so what happens when you want to get out? And he said, well, who would want to get out? The game is that you buy until it goes to an IPO, initial product offering on the initial placement offering on the market. And I said, well, what happens when something is grossly overinflated in price? Because this comes back to the Bitcoin article. The reason we need to understand value is so that we can price the value. And when something is overpriced, we want to be able to sell it. When something is underpriced, we want to be able to buy it. When it's fair value and it's fairly priced, then we want to hold it. And I said, well, look at all the large language models. That's a completely circuitous business model that's headed in one direction and one direction only, unless and until they can get the average person to pay $2,000 a month rather than $20 a month for their ChatGPT base access. It is obviously unsustainably insane. Why do we have this problem coming back up every time? We had it with blockchain, layer one, layer two, layer all the nonsense. You had it with I forget the name of them now. What was that chain that came out in the late teens? And EOS. We're going to solve. We're going to solve blockchain. How? Blank face. We're going to solve blockchain. And it was basically a mantra that they're going to solve blockchain. You just have to give them money. And they had this very gamified system, which brought them in about $8 billion in then Bitcoin and ETH value. It must be in the tens of billions now. And they've done absolutely nothing with it. But
Billions?
yeah, 8 billion was their their initial coin offering reap. And most of it was in Bitcoin and ETH. So look at what the 2017 value of those things was, and look at what it is now, and understand that EOS don't spend any money on anything that amounts to technical development. It's a complete epic fail, but they still have their money. What is wrong with the way that we approach these things? Because there's an element where I sort of know the answer to this question, because I had a lot of PhDs working in the original version of QPQ, and their arrogance was spectacular. They had a constant need to be the smartest guy in the room, and to be published and all these things. And so maybe making grand outlandish claims is the route to that. But when I talk to you guys, you're so grounded with these things and so factual. It's not just a function of being high functioning autists. It's what I think that everybody should be doing in this space. I think all of us should be telling the absolute truth. What do we fear from the truth? And when you have people talking about quantum computing like it's a present reality, forgetting all of the physical realities that come with it, forgetting all of the issues around it, the assumption that a quantum is a little bit like, the nearest I can think to it, it's like HAL. Remember HAL from Space Odyssey 2001?
Yes, Dave.
What I think goes off in people's heads is HAL. Because they think, right, there's going to be large language models, which equals AI. We know it doesn't. Artificial intelligence and a large language model are not the same thing, because an artificial intelligence has the capacity to think creatively. LLMs do not. They are completely unoriginal. But the assumption seems to be that this artificial intelligence will emerge that will take over all the quantum computers, or that quantum computers will provide the breakthrough for artificial intelligence. And all of a sudden, it will decide to destroy everything and become incredibly rich and take all the money off everybody and hack all of their accounts and blah, 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 without ever thinking, well, hold on a second. Why would a machine want to hack everybody's accounts? Machines aren't motivated by the same. Even if you had an artificial intelligence that was run by the most incredible quantum computers on Earth, where did the supposition come from that the first thing it would do, which is what a bad human would do if it had that kind of power, is hack everybody's accounts and drain them of all the money? Because here's the problem with that fundamentally, and Bitcoin is experiencing this right now with all the hodling. If a currency isn't current, it's not a currency. It's simply a useless collection of things that you have in your account. And if everyone else has none, then you don't have anything.
Right. You said something important. You said, hold on. Let's think about this. These are two things that people don't do.
Forgive me. Yeah, let's not pause and think.
Yeah, to go back to our friend Peter, who you introduced as a genius mathematician, and then you read what he wrote, and as impressive as the analysis is, it is not genius level math. Any accountant can follow the math.
It's just genius level noticing, and hold on, stop, let's think about this, noticing.
Right. And I recall when he once told about a private discussion he had with a close friend who asked, what would it take for you to agree with me? And he said, you just have to be right.
Sorry, I know the answer to this. Sorry, start again. What would it take for, go on.
For you to agree with me? And his answer was, "You just have to be right." And and
Yeah.
Be careful who you tell
this
that
is
to in your life.
and this is yeah, and of course people who are similarly autistic um, in their way of approaching the world think that yeah that's the way it is, and other people think what an asshole.
Yeah,
It's like,
that's true.
so
Well,
you're the guy who's right all the time, and but it's really the like that quote, who was that Keynes? Was that, when the facts change, I change my mind? What do you do, sir? Um, and it
look, I
it
think
is
we
one
have
of
a.
the things about, for example, being a good programmer is you have a lot of, I mean, the good idea fairy is a constant guest in your head. You have tons of things that you think are brilliant ideas, and you try them out, and you are most of the time proven wrong. When you try to build it, one of the nice things about programming is that you can be in this loop almost constantly and be proven wrong hundreds of times a day. And then through that process, you will find occasional nuggets. Hopefully, if you're a good programmer, this is what comes out of the process, that you will actually be able to prove that some ideas are really good. And I mean, one of the things that we have found repeatedly when we've been working on in sort of the Gajumaru architecture is that it keeps revealing insights to us that we actually didn't think of initially, but is sort of a nice way to feel that, okay, it was actually a good idea. It was an even better idea than I thought when I came up with it. And then that becomes a signal, okay, keep digging here because you're actually onto something. And then you actually, during that process, you realize that, okay, these things were actually stupid. So if we remove those, then we see more of the truth that is revealed to us. And this is, if you have that attitude that, well, I was actually asking some AI bots to tell me the source of the quote, "The truth is all there is. Usually it's best to know it." I don't know where it comes from. I was asking Grok and I was asking ChatGPT, and then I decided, well, maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm the one who thought that, and so it's who should be quoted. But I don't think it is. I think it was Tom Hanks in some movie or whatever. But it's just a silly silly way to describe it. It's like, if you don't get married to something as the truth, and you think that, okay, I've got it now, I'm just going to run with this, and to heck with anyone who claims that I'm actually wrong about this, then you have these explosions where you start screaming at someone who points out something that you actually feel might be true, but if it is, then you have egg on your face. So I'm just going to shout this guy down until he stops saying that, and then I can continue running with my truth. And that is has turned out to be a hugely effective pattern, especially in the social media world, where you can.
Well, that's a good example. Charles Hodgkinson is a globally known person. I'm a unknown person, and I was having a quiet discussion with him where I said, "Look, um, actually, the impetus of the conversation was that I said to him that I think Cardano have done some really interesting things around proof of stake. Um, we've built the world's first actual blockchain that actually works, minting real money that really works. It's Bitcoin made hundreds of thousands of times more efficient with native enterprise grade virtual machines and smart contracts. The view I have is that we create this open resource layer that then initiates the It makes possible a universe of interoperable infrastructure. And some of that infrastructure is going to want to use some sort of mechanism of consensus from a proof of stake. Well, I think Cardano have done some really interesting work here, and it would be interesting to see if we could license Cardano's algorithm for people to develop an associate chain that uses the Cardano model. And then he went on asking me why I thought this, and I said, well, it's very simple. You cannot trust, the object of blockchain is to trust the message, not the messenger, securely at scale. It is to assume that everyone's a bad actor and not have to trust any actor, but only the message itself. And I said, fundamentally, any proof of stake system can be gamed. A system that has anonymous proof of stake, we have to assume is gamed, at which point he started screaming his head off. Now, the thing is, when he was screaming his head off, he was exerting the power you just described. I'm a virtual nobody. He is a very famous person. So he was hoping that by screaming at me for exposing the flaw in what he has been working on, that I would shut up and go away. Now, I didn't shut up and go away. I told him not to be a child and walked off. But what you're seeing in this industry, so you've touched upon it in terms of internal culture, that within the QPQ core team, there's an understanding that you can't be wrong for very long, because the moment that you say something that's wrong, somebody else in the team will correct you, whether you want to call that rubber ducking or debate. But ultimately, it's an environment in which everybody accepts that you're just going to get the unvarnished, horrible truth, but that truth is really valuable and it allows us to make leaps and steps and move forward quickly and efficiently in a way that it would appear that others don't. So when people have come into the group, like Jeff Thompson recently, he's amazed that people like Ulf and Craig are actually quite happy to be wrong. And I said, well, no, that's our internal culture. Everybody can be wrong and everybody then learns, whether that's through an empirical testing process or it's through debate and discussion. But I still come back to this question. I would think that should be the norm of how people behave, perhaps because I'm a bit like you guys also. But that's clearly not how the world behaves, because people get to the point where a deeply flawed idea is rammed down everybody's throats with such conviction and certainty that people who don't have the expertise guess that this person does and back them with vast amounts of money. This is exactly what we've seen with Canton. The global synchronizer is laughable. The whole Canton approach is laughable. We looked at it a year ago and there was no discernible blockchain in anything that they do. Today, there is a distributed ledger, but it's a distributed ledger controlled by Canton and its foundation. This is not in any way, this is not a distributed ledger. This is decentralization as theater. And I can keep pointing at it, whether it's layer ones, layer twos, so-called now layer threes, zero knowledge proof roll-ups. There's a litany of these things out there. And now we have large language models, we're being told, are AI, that they're perfect, they can do everything. In fact, we know from testing them that they're extraordinarily limited and they're stuck with hallucination. We get on to quantum computing and we're being told that the world as we know it is going to change immediately. But it isn't.
Well, I think there's an internal and external culture problem. If I'm wrong inside of one of our discussions internally, which we let be open, like anybody can see them, but the people I'm talking with are internal to us primarily, right? Ulf points out something to me, or Dimitar, he snipes my ideas all the time. It's like half of his job is telling me how wrong I am. But that's, if you don't, you're always going to have a little bit of a slight ego, just a moment of that, right? When you're wrong. But the reward afterwards is so much greater because internally there's no like retribution. Not like, oh, we'll never listen to that guy because he's just a dummy. That doesn't happen. ever. Like, well, any number of us have had silly ideas and we're willing to say them. Like, the instant something crosses Ulf's mind when we're brainstorming, he'll just say it. And then usually before I get to go, ha, he goes, ha, to himself and then keeps kind of free flow thinking. Right? So that's kind of an interactive process together. My point being that there's no case, it's never a possibility that being wrong results in like a downgrade, even socially, within the group, because we all have a lot of, everybody's everyone's very proven to one another, which is a rare thing. So we've kind of got a special situation here, is my point. Externally, though, if you look externally at especially if you live in a world of bullshit, right? So just imagine that right and wrong is like a matter of opinion. You're selling bullshit and you're trying to ride the tulip craze. Now your reputation as being identified as the person who's never wrong drives the price of your tulips. Whatever color you got, it's the best color ever because you said it is. And if your reputation is ever threatened, they view being wrong as a reputational attack, as opposed to something that exists in the world of real truth and falsehood. So they shy away from being wrong, or the perception of having been wrong. They have to find some way, because remember, they're not doing anything. No one's doing business on blockchain until we set up actual marketplaces on like for real stuff, which is what we're pushing, right? That's the use case we want to solve. Nobody wants to solve that. Nobody even wants to touch a real marketplace use case where I could like go buy shoes and bicycles and stuff, or hire people for, in a live active crypto market, because that would be real. And now people have to start reevaluating. Wait, what about the monkey pictures I bought for $1 billion? That guy's hiring programmers with this. I bought pictures of monkeys that everyone can see. Where's the real value? That if you bring reality into the world of bullshit, the reality starts like eating everything. It's terrifying. So you can't. My point is, there's going to be a natural defense that they're going to stand up, and psychologically, they won't let themselves be known to themselves as dealing in bullshit. That's a big anyway. My point is that why are people like this? Like, I've observed what I just described like all over the place. I even saw it in the military, which is crazy, because like you can be wrong there and like die, or worse, other people die, and people just go right on with it.
And of course, in that, I mean, one of the things you kind of learn when you're at least get high enough up in large organizations that you can witness how decisions are made and especially corrected, that some big mistakes that are like corporate strategy level mistakes usually can only be corrected if the world shifts enough that the decision makers can say, well, it's a totally different ballgame now. We were right then, but now things have changed so much that we have to make we have to shift gears. Or those people move on and are replaced by others. That there are so many people who associate being powerful with always being right, and admitting a mistake essentially means you lose prestige. Now, I think one of the things that I was really happy that I clued into quickly in my my own career, that was actually when I was pretty young. I was in Alaska. I'd been working on a essentially geographical resource tracking system for state troopers and emergency responders, and I was using this exotic database programming language on the Mac called Omnis 5. Well, it was actually portable, so it ran on Windows too. And I had a really nice little application, except it hit some memory leak, and so it would crash fairly quickly. But as far as I knew, I was pretty much the only one I didn't know of any similar system ever or in the world that quite did what this did. It was sort of a real-time decision support system. There was a similar thing for the US Air Force, but it wasn't quite as this was a generalized version of that. And then we found a guy in Canada who was using the same tools, almost had built the same application. So we decided that we have to meet that guy. And he was a veteran, and he had been spending 10 years on this. I was into my, well, possibly my second year of working with this application. So we got together and we could compare notes, and he had the same problem with the same memory leak in the tool set and everything. But the interesting thing was we could not work together, or primarily he did not want to work with me. And I thought this was really weird. So I was asking my mentor there, is like, well, what is going on here? He is like, we are two guys who had the same idea, and we were so close to having something that was really brilliant and really solving a pressing problem. And if we worked together, we could actually bring this to market together. And it just didn't work out. And so what my mentor said was like, well, he was really proud coming in, and you come here and you're, you know, basically just a snot-nosed kid who has been working on this for a year, and you got as far as he did in 10 years. So of course he wouldn't want to work with you. And I thought, well, that is really stupid. But I realized that we kind of was stuck in that he wanted to be the expert and he wanted to be right. And I just sort of accidentally undermined him, and I just walked right into it too, because I thought that, oh, this is just brilliant. Now we're going to work together. And that did not happen. But after that, I started trying to experiment with, okay, maybe I should just essentially go into situations with the attitude that there's probably a lot I don't know about this, and I may be wrong. So let's just have you, our customer, tell us what you are doing so we can learn from you, and then we'll see if we can actually help eventually. Hopefully we can. Otherwise, we've been your rubber duckies, and we can tell you at the end how you did everything right. And that will be embarrassing to us, but hey, good for you. And I learned that that was so much more popular, and people really liked it because then they could show how knowledgeable they were, and I was not a threat to them. And typically, if I had anything to bring to the table, that would materialize anyway, once I figured out what people actually needed help with. But I had to be patient and not jump at the first opportunity to show how brilliant I was, and just hope that eventually, if I have anything to contribute, the opportunity will eventually come. Or otherwise, I guess I've learned something. And that really changed a lot in terms of how I sort of trained myself to interact with people. And
But we have to appreciate maybe that these patterns, that, like, I take a little bit different approach to make sure that the group gets moving at all, because we often work with people who are a little bit, they're either deliberately like you in patient mode, or they're not very assertive. So I'll just go ahead and be the assertive one if it's that kind of group to get the ball rolling. And then everything I say that's dumb, I'll just let that roll back. I don't care.
Yeah, that's the evolution of this. That not just pretend that you know less than you actually do, but actually dare to be wrong and say, okay, I'm just going to jump in here and let you prove me wrong. And
yeah,
and then
but that's
embarrassing. Embarrassment will be more tangible because then you will actually have egg on your face, and then you just say, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, now we've
it's
actually
gotta
moved
be on
forward.
someone.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's the I guess my point though is that either approach that's taken, the wait and see or be the initiator, either direction that we go, we're absolutely ruling out the possibility of behaving as charlatans. And the problem is that right now, this is the everything is fake economy. So charlatanry, playing con games, that's what's maximally rewarded right now. We are not positioning ourselves to stand in that seat. So when we do encounter them, it feels very alien because we're not used to that, because we're trying to make a thing that works. And
Yeah.
things that work are over here, and things that get lots of money are over here. They're not the same,
of course,
unfortunately.
And of course, one of the things that has been really destructive is sort of the postmodern view that there is no absolute truth. So, well, in practice, I'm going to push my truth. And if I can push harder than you, my truth wins out. And I haven't been that effective in trying to tell those people that, well, just because it's very hard to point to an absolute truth and saying, yes, this is verifiably true. What classical science learned quite a long time ago was that, well, but you can actually falsify things. You can prove things false, and this is how we progress. So the key to being a good scientist or engineer is that you dare to expose your ideas to falsification, and then you weed out the wrong ideas until you're left with better ones.
I wonder if our programming pattern is a little bit ingrained in that too, where we'll throw something at the wall and see if it sticks by asserting like every line and seeing what, sometimes what doesn't work out, but getting that feedback immediately. Sometimes it's like that at the design level where, I'll come up with an idea and then basically I'm waiting to see. I'm doing a lot of like assertions per proposition, and somewhere along there, you or Dimitar, maybe Peter's going to come in and say, no, or Jarvis. He'll be like, oh yeah, but this. And so the whole line of reasoning crashed right then. But it crashed right then. I didn't have to spend weeks working on it to find out that it sucks or there's a hole in it later.
Yes.
Which is a huge time savings.
If you are wrong, you want to find out as quickly as possible.
Right.
So that you can correct yourself and be more right moving forward.
If your ideas fester, if your ideas fester long enough in a wrong state, they might have grown on you and become your pet ideas. And then letting go of them sucks.
Well, so, is that what we're seeing with the responses to my article from some of the Bitcoin faithful who are adamantly insisting that it's a store of value despite vast switches in price, and they're claiming things like, oh, it's an immature market despite the fact it's 16 years old. They're saying, oh, but look, gold fell by 45% between the six-year period during which there was massive economic expansion. So the fear factor, the flight to quality issue around gold meant that the price fell. This is the catch with the fear factor thing, is you actually pay a price for being fearful. That's what the fear factor, the flight to quality thing extracts from you, is that price. But they don't seem to get that gold did that over a period of time with clear economic incentive to do so, i.e. it went from being a flight to quality in 2008, 2009, 2010 to being an unwinding of that fear factor as the economy then grew again, 2011 to 2019. And gold falling by 45% over that period is not remotely the same thing as Bitcoin changing value by 35% in 6 weeks. But that cognitive dissonance, I think there's an extent to which in talking to one another, we kind of ruin one another to talk to the rest of the world because we don't have that option internally. So externally, when people are presented with a clear, logical, cogent argument, and they reject it in favor of holding dearly onto the lie that is clearly a lie, that probably deep down they know is a lie, but it's a lie that makes them feel good today.
We're also not as black-pilled as they are. We think we can make a thing that actually works. They don't think they can make anything, so they're holding on to they're not investing in their own businesses, are they? They're trying to hold Bitcoin. That's like the opposite of action. There's a whole different thing happening there.
I think an aspect of it is like that guy in the queue in Dublin 10 years ago, that he wanted to believe it, because if he believed it, it might come true. And the alternative was to confront the reality of his situation, which was that he worked as a cameraman for RTE. That's a relatively low paid job. And the chances of him, RTE sits right in the most expensive, that's the national broadcaster, sits in the most expensive part of Dublin to live in. So the chances of him ever being able to afford a home within an hour commute of his place of work were vanishingly remote, unless his parents were to sell their farm and leave the whole thing to him. So the only way that he had to sustain the illusion that his work was worthy, and I don't mean that I'm judging his work as worthy, I mean that the economic system that has deflated human capital value so very greatly has established what his value is. That if he let go of that hope that actually Bitcoin was going to go to 500,000, a million, which is, all the claims you see, all these articles people are writing that Bitcoin's going to hit 250,000 this year. It got halfway there. All of this is about people clinging to hope in a situation where the reality is to confront the complete absence of hope without radical change. And to your point, Craig, they don't think that radical change is possible. We do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess the second part of that is actually a question, and I'm going to have to go back and think through this myself, just what I've seen in my own life, into weird places I've been and lived. At what point did so many people, and this is especially acute in the West, like I don't feel it in my neighborhood, but I sure did in like Austin and Phoenix and places like that, that the entire purpose of life is to become your own little private prince who's rich and never has to work. That's not a thing where I live here, but it seems like that's like the only goal, is to become a rich guy so that I don't have to work anymore. That sense of things is so pervasive. Like that goal, it's like the meaning making structure of the West is based on this idea of becoming the rich guy now. And it doesn't, like, okay, so I don't know, it's like all the people that win the lottery and then they, they're not around in a couple of years because it actually sucked. That, it's like a dog chasing cars, like what, it's like, maybe that's how you ruin a greyhound, right? If they ever actually catch the rabbit. There's some aspect of that that's very unbalanced, and I don't know. I'm not trying to get like philosophical or religious, but there's kind of like a sense of abandonment of the sense of transcendent goals that live beyond you seems to be very poisonous.
Well, I mean, look, let's go
I
to traditional ideas. I mean, for example, the idea that children respected their mother and their father is being lost today. The men are famously not so good at speaking or acting in an emotionally connected way, that whether it's biology or raising, that we're discouraged from being open and honest about how we feel. So how does a father show love? He shows love through working and putting the metaphorical bread on the table. And the children respect that work. The mother, the same. if you go to the more traditional family model, the mother was the glue that made the family work, the one that brought the children into the world and sustained the family, and you respected her for that. What you're talking about, quite rightly, is that there's almost an abdication from the desire to have any meaning in life. And maybe this is down to a removal of the religious drivers that we have in life, that we've lost many of the moral compass that we had. So now we have a state where life is all about now and never about tomorrow. It's never about building for something more. And what we've ended up with is this deeply selfish, highly destructive state where, as long as you're all right, it doesn't matter how anyone else is. And there's nothing more to life than living it right now. Live for now. Forget about tomorrow. Forget about the days to come. Forget about the generations to come. And in a world in which we can ignore the importance of the generations who follow, then actually all of the money printing, all of the egregious destruction, all of the lies that we see being told about technology and its utilization, it's not that they become justifiable. They just they don't mean anything. If there is no future that you're delivering for, if it is all about your hedonistic fulfillment today, what does it matter about telling the truth? It's irrelevant, surely. The truth is irrelevant if there is no tomorrow that you care about.
If this sense of things is pervasive, which it seems to be, actually we should be asking a very different question. Not how are there so many Ponzi's, but how are there not more?
Mm-hmm. So
because everything's a card game then.
Well, I mean, people are capable of self-correcting, or at least at some scale. And also culturally, I guess, we would like to wish that it happens more quickly. Of course, I'm from a weird culture that famously scared the hell out of Tim Pool, for example, when he visited Sweden. And he thought that it was just so weird that people were essentially engaging in theater, as far as he could tell. As an American, he came in and just was asking people blunt questions, and they were terrified to give him honest answers. And it's been sort of argued that Swedish consensus culture, or maybe Scandinavian consensus culture, works in the way that people will just pretend to be in total agreement on something until it is no longer possible to maintain the illusion. And then that facade comes crumbling down, and there is already a ready facade behind it. And people will just switch to the new consensus and never acknowledge that they changed their mind at all. And that's sort of a spooky thing. It's like we kind of just move forward. It's like, oh, this is the truth now. And this can be extremely annoying while you're trying to get people to see that there is a systemic problem. And everyone will just go, shut up, bigot. Or racist, or fascist, or whatever is the invective of the day to get people to shut up. Until suddenly, I mean, if you're observant, you can see small signs that you can see more and more people actually daring to speak about something, actually being brave enough to make an observation. And then, for example, in some public occasions or in some meetings, you're at a luncheon, someone dares to ask a question that feels really edgy, You can sense the tension in the room. Ooh, she asked the question. And then they didn't get killed for it. And then everyone afterwards says, oh, yeah, I agree with you. Quietly. And then you start getting some hope that, okay, I am not the only one seeing this. And then after a while, maybe a couple of years later, it's as if no one is questioning it anymore. It's not, oh, that's boring. That's so, 5 years ago. Where, like, for a while, no one could question the radical feminist dogma. Nowadays, they are a speck in the opinion polls. It's the radical feminist party that had in their party program that men systematically oppress women everywhere and always. And I used to try to say that that kind of thing is not so good to put in your program, because then you form your organization around the assumption that that has to be true. And a curse on anyone who tries to falsify that, because that is your core tenet. And your idea is, if you vote for us, we will change that. But then you're actually making yourself irrelevant, because then your core tenet is no longer true. So it turns out your organization will keep perpetuating what you claim is the truth, rather than trying to eliminate it, because you don't want to eliminate essentially the core of your influence. Like, if that is no longer true, why do we need you?
Well, that's almost that's almost a bureaucratic problem. Any government project that lasts more than about 2 years has an incentive to foster more of whatever the problem is that it was created as a result.
And I guess the problem was, when you're trying to push that as an undisputable truth in one of the most egalitarian societies ever, people are eventually going to get tired of you and say, okay, what you are describing. So essentially it was like more and more women started saying, okay, you are acting like the bullies in the schoolyard that I was really happy to get away from. So shut up. I'm not going to listen to you. I don't feel oppressed. Let me just get on with my life. And
oh, you must be brainwashed.
And then it's not the end of it. Certainly wasn't the end of feminism. It was sort of the resurgence of constructive feminism, where it wasn't necessarily giving the floor to the people who thought that Society for Cutting Up Men was the best book ever.
Well, this kind of blackpilling, I don't know, the sort of social poisons that are floating around, the everything is fake economy, the observation that there's no way to get ahead if you're just in the wrong cohort, and it's not even always true that you can't get ahead. It's just that once you feel that that's true, you start behaving as if that's true, and then it now definitely is true. If everybody in society is black-pilled, if everybody in a given society believes that tomorrow's going to be worse than today, and that's just the truth, they will behave in ways that are definitely going to bring that to become to truth. That's going to manifest that prediction, because you're going to make short-sighted, crappy decisions. And I just can't escape the thought that there's a significant portion of at least the West, if not quite a few other places, that are infected with this kind of the black pill bug right now. And because they're black pilled, they think that the future is going to be crap. And because they think it's going to be crap, they behave as if it's going to be crap, making short-sighted decisions. And again, it's almost like we could ask the opposite question: not how are there so many Ponzi's, but how could there not be? How could there not be more?
And I guess in some sense, I think you can see a lot of people who are really trying to find their way back to something that was essentially broken, discarded prematurely, without really having anything solid to replace it with. So
Yeah.
obviously, we killed God.
I see a lot of flailing attempts to try to get back to that, and a lot of people misunderstand. The funniest thing that I see is people who are very undecided on the God question,
Mm-hmm.
and who used to think, when it was fashionable to, well, I guess it still is fashionable to believe that the religious people are just like dumb, uneducated hicks or whatever. But a lot of the folks that I know who are both very high in openness and also very kind of aggressively self-taught, as a lot of people that we know are, have come all the way back around to questioning why they were deriding religious people before, and now recognizing, no, wait, there's a whole body of absolutely valid social knowledge and concepts here. I'm undecided on the God question, but this pattern is definitely a very powerful cultural pattern. It's a very effective and successful one. Why would anyone deride that unless your goal was just to destroy? And
So
I've seen that sentiment from a lot of very intelligent people lately who are, again, undecided. They didn't grow up in the church or whatever, but they're reevaluating a lot of these ideas.
and I think a lot of there is also um, the problem. One thing I often sort of come back to is the problem that we, in the globalized community, where we try to pretend that there are no borders, and we are
Right.
trying to sort of solve global humanity once and for all, we end up in way beyond the complexity ceiling, where it's just, it is not possible to find a recipe that works. And people are actually going to actively defy any solution that you present. Some more than others. So you live in Japan. The Japanese are pretty effective at defending their culture. Swedes have been
So far.
actually surprisingly extremely bad at it, at least in the last few decades. We used to be really good at it before, and then we flipped, as we do, and decided to go full speed ahead in a different direction. It used to be, for example, in Sweden, it used to be a pastime to discuss what is uniquely Swedish. Until suddenly it became a pastime to be totally baffled that anyone could ever think that there is anything typically Swedish. And anyone who has met any Swedes will realize how preposterous the second view is.
And we're going to have to be careful here because this is into YouTube ban territory. I was talking to someone the other day and trying to pull out the discussion between the state and the nation, without necessarily pointing out that the person who said that the nation should serve the state was, in fact, Mussolini.
I was about to say, that sounds badly familiar in like not a great way.
Well, it is, and adopted by every totalitarian, authoritarian state since, leading the pack being, of course, the EU, SSR, and Ursula von der Palpatine. So
this is not YouTube ban territory. I will confess that I haven't read the latest code of conduct.
We're going to skate on the rules here, but my position has always been that a nation is self-defining because it has a unitary culture where it shares mores, values, ideas, conventions, and that those mores, values, ideas, and conventions change from one nation to the next because nations are self-defining. They are a group of people who accept, adhere, and believe in that collective of things that define a culture. I mean, this is why I get shouted down by a lot of people about this, but I think that multi-ethnic states work just fine. Multicultural states do not, because the
yeah.
nation is not united behind it. The state should serve the nation, not the nation should serve the state. And so we should talk about limited government. We should talk about electoral oversight, the capacity for a recall of politicians who make promises that they then shred the minute they get into power, as if they've got 5 years to do as they please. Unfortunately, I think the direction of travel we're on is for a wholesale democratic reassessment and realignment of how all of these things should work going forward, because I honestly believe that the pathway we're on, and I say this with no pleasure or pride, is a choice between the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, which would be pretty next to the 1789 French Revolution. But when you compress and depress and oppress people to the extent that these authoritarian systems have and do, leading which is the destruction of human capital value through the printing of money and the taxation of our work through fractured, fragmented infrastructure, the thing I think that everybody is missing is that violence is always a choice. And our position as a team is we'd really like it if that violence didn't have to happen. There are off ramps. We need to change this. We need to change the direction of travel that we're on, because and this goes back to why aren't people looking beyond the hedonistic present? If nobody looks beyond the hedonistic present, then everybody is headed for the same fate, which is definitely going to be the 1789 French Revolution, but on a global scale. And I'm horrified by what I see coming. And my wife criticizes me that I spend all of my time thinking about the future and not enough thinking about the present, and I sacrifice my well-being and health in order to continue to do this. I know you guys are doing the same, but none of us can look away. It's forget what it was in literature, that this terrible thing that once you see it, you can never take your eyes away. There's an example in Greek mythology, which was the Hydra, that once you saw the horror of the Hydra, you were turned to stone. Why were you turned to stone? It's a metaphor, I think. The metaphor being that you are now unable to look away from this horror, that you know now that something must be done to combat it. I forget the metaphor I think it may have been Tolkien, but I'm thinking it was more like Dickens or Henry James, where there was something terrible that they then they couldn't avert their eyes from. And I have 5 children. You guys have lots of children. What world are they growing up into if this is what we hand them, and if we don't take the responsibility to change it? That I can't stop thinking about. I can't stop thinking that it isn't enough for me to say, right, if I get my children, if we can get everything working and the money can flow again, and I can bring my family back together here in Switzerland, that we're going to be fine where we are. I joke that I live in a valley with 7,000 people and 11,000 registered assault rifles. And at one end of the valley, they stopped the Holy Roman Empire, who were the superpower of the time. But that isn't enough. Being that I can be okay, that my family can be okay, albeit that we'd have to fight for our survival, even so, with the advantages listed above. That isn't good enough. We should want for something better. And I think what constantly astounds me when I look at all of these things is how the world at large is both blind to this, willfully blind to this, and how much worse the picture gets as a result. It's really, I wish I could stop thinking about it, but I can't.
So
We live
and I
in an
guess
amazing
what
time.
we can try to do, and I guess the thing that we are trying to push is at least a framework, an architecture that makes it easier for people to take back the initiative and localize their problems so that they can actually return back to sanity. Because this, again, the madness of trying to solve global humanity essentially is, there is just no way. We do not have the capacity to do it. It just ends up going terribly wrong, and it tends to also drive people more or less mad or polarize people, because people will choose their radical truth, essentially, that radically simplifies existence because what they are being pushed into is too hard to grasp. And
If it's easy to fall into that thinking of, if only everyone would just X, then this will be fine. And then it's so close to just say, I must force everyone to do X. Well, that's the part that's never going to happen. You have to fix your neighborhood. You have to know who your neighbors are. God, that's another one that I saw in the US that blew my mind. Not just the US, some places in Europe too. People that have lived next to each other for years and don't even know each other's names. It's astounding to me how non-communal communities can be. But they know their Twitter friends.
And the idea that we are going to be able to come up with a powerful global multicultural committee that's just going to work things out.
Yeah, right.
I think that has been fairly thoroughly falsified by now. I mean, not to say that you shouldn't try, but you should absolutely respect the limits of what such assemblies can even be entrusted with.
Well, look at what happened with social media, with the cross-cultural communication. When I was a kid, the internet was going to connect everybody, and that was going to bring in global peace, because the only reason there's ever violence is because of misunderstandings, which is completely wrong. Now we can talk to each other instantly, speed of light. We can yell at each other on Twitter, and all that's happened is social media, whereas previously we would fill in the blanks that we don't know about each other with charitable assumptions about, oh, interesting culture X does X, Y, and Z, or whatever. Now we know exactly how much they hate us, and so how much we hate them in return, and exactly why, too. We can enumerate the reasons why they suck instantly, and they do the same back. And everyone just hates it. We just found out how incompatible we are really quick at a very personal level now. So the dream that, you love all cultures and all people and we're all one and everything's, and then just go online for 5 minutes and you'll see how totally not true that is.
Yeah. And then you dream that AI is going to be sort of the thing that brings people together, especially if it's a potty trained AI that doesn't say anything mean to anyone. And
but telling them that they're wrong when they're actually wrong is mean. So, as we established earlier, so you can't do that.
I think there was an MIT study from earlier this year, a few months ago, where they actually could tell how students using AI to write their essays, their brains actually shut down and have difficulty rebooting, essentially, even if you give them a sort of a mentally challenging task afterwards. And going out and searching for information doesn't have that effect. But if you just go to the AI and say, write this for me, is about as bad as just plopping down in front of the television and getting your news fed to you. It shuts down critical thinking.
What
And is
we had a study in the Army about that, not with regard to writing stuff in AI, but with regard to uh, cognitive spatial tasks and orienteering, where if you took people and made them do map and compass navigation, they had a completely different mental model of the world than people who had just used GPS and used things like Google Maps to navigate and didn't ever guide themselves. They just waited for the thing to tell them when to turn or where to go. The part of their brain that
yeah, and
does
if you
spatial
make a wrong
association,
turn, it's just gonna
it'll
reroute
just
you and say, okay, that's fine, just go this way next time.
yeah. So their mental
Yeah.
the part of the brain that does spatial association physically atrophies. It's terrifying, actually, when you start realizing that every time you accept information and really process it, or are just passive. So the passive and passive states always wind up in mental atrophy, and active states rewire you actively. So what are you reprogramming yourself for? There's always these little reward cycles. What are you actually reprogramming yourself for? Every time you do something, you're recoding yourself. And these are physical changes. When you sleep, the lymphatic system starts washing out all the weird amyloids that have built up in weird places. And it's one of the gorillion reasons that you need to sleep some. The physical synapse change, the strength of the pathways with alternate. You get hit in the head and something breaks, but there's enough connections that it's able to reroute and recover from that because it was a very, very strong connection with multiple pathways there. Those things are physical. They are physically insights, kind of like when you build muscle, your muscle physically changes. That's happens in your brain. It's kind of gross to think about, but it happens inside of your brain too. And people are physically rewiring themselves. That's a little bit scary. The there's the dangerous. We're way off topic now, but the feared, the AI loop feedback loop that I fear most is the one where AI is designed to entertain in whatever way. And its only criteria for success is to evolve itself forward by exerting maximum stimulus and measuring that stimulus and guiding itself, adjusting itself constantly into whatever feedback loop gives you the maximum stimulus. That could go wrong in so many ways. And actually, there's no way that can't go wrong. That's going to one shot. That's so bad. I believe that's one of the biggest selection filters that we face, like in evolution right now, is there's going to be a certain category of people that are resistant to that, and another category of people that are just one-shotted by it, and that's it. That's basically the end of them. Their brain's going to be fried. Then I don't see a path to recovery back from that because it's going to leave such a deep set of reinforced loops in people's heads that they're never going to not trigger on whatever the max stimulus was. And I just don't see that's going to break people. There's going to be a certain category of people that are just broken by that.
So before we actually get the ban, let's
I'm
recap.
aiming for it. Sorry.
Yeah, no, look, the thing is, if people want to understand why we have taken the risks we've taken, why we didn't take the easier routes that were available to us, these are the reasons why. Ultimately, people aren't motivated to go to the lengths that we've gone to by the potential to get money. And
yeah,
I go back to my conversation with my then 10-year-old son who said, Dad, if everything in QPQ works, will you be as rich as Elon Musk? And I said, good God, no. And he said, why not, Daddy? Because child logic. Isn't what you do as good as what he does? And I said, no, what we're going to do is way better than X or rockets or Teslas. It's actually changing the entirety of our human economy. It's reestablishing people as sovereign to themselves. And he said, well, then why won't you be richer? And I said, well, because in order for what we're doing to work, we have to give the majority of it to the world. We can only take a small piece of it as thanks for what we've done. And that small bit, the promise of one day having money that is genuinely transformational, isn't enough to go through what we've been through over the last few years to get here. What I've been going through for the last 24 years to keep hold of this idea. There is no monetary motivation you can give somebody in the world that is enough to make that okay. I have this dispute with my wife who says that my children don't understand how much I love them because I don't spend enough time with them, in part because I have to be here in Switzerland to make this work. And I say, well, one day I hope they do. I hope they understand that I sacrificed everything I could sacrifice in order to deliver to them a world in which they would be safe, where they could have hope of having children, a home, that they didn't live, as Craig coined the term, Shanghai billionaires, that instead they could be Tokyo or Zurich millionaires, that you can walk down the street in safety, that you don't have to walk around with an automatic rifle strapped to your body like they do in Israel, not for different reasons. But what you see in Israel today is where society at large is headed because of the breakdown of the community, social, and cultural fabrics. All of these things are dissolving at the same time. And because I've seen these things for so many years, I have never been able to avert my gaze. And I hope one day my children will look at this and say, yeah, Dad wasn't a great father in the sense of he didn't go out and play football with me. He wasn't around that much, but they might understand why, that I desperately do not want them to inherit the world that is otherwise being handed to them, nor them, nor my grandchildren. And selfishly, you could say that I'm being selfish looking at just my children and my grandchildren and the antecedents from there. But in order for them to live a good life, they have to live within a functioning and good culture and society. So it's not a case of I can just solve for my family. None of us can. We either solve for all of our families together, or we all fail together.
Mm-hmm.
And on that final statement, we'll close the discussion. Thank you for joining us. I hope the rambling discussion we had held your interest. I know that it's going to be broken down into other pieces, but we still have a hope that one day people will want to watch these things and really get into our heads, because these conversations, we don't decide what we're going to talk about beforehand other than vague subject line matters. Yeah, obviously. They're very open discussions, and I defy you to point at any other project anywhere, whether it's an AI, blockchain, or quantum computing, where anybody is being as transparent, open, and honest as we are. And we're being transparent, open, and honest because we have nothing to hide. Everything that we have to say is what we believe to be the truth. We're willing to be argued out of it if it turns out that we're wrong. But what was the phrase again, Ulf?
What can I say to make you agree with me? You just have to be right.
There you go. And that's the rule. So with that, thank you all very much indeed, and good day. Bye-bye.